The 3D Mario games give a lot of freedom with how you want to complete the game, but the exact method of reaching the credits normally varies up a bit. Sometimes it's somewhat structured, and other times, Nintendo just slaps you on the bum and tells you to have at it. Whatever the case though, I think that the multitude of options they provide kinda set the standard for 3D platformers, and it's no wonder that games like Banjo-Kazooie followed suit. So let's give a look at some of the different methods used and try to decide which entries did it best. I'm Wes the Explosion, and this week we'll be talking about collecting miniaturized celestial bodies in 3D Mario. It's kind of amazing how little is required in Super Mario 64. I mean, you have to defeat Bowser a few times, either for a key or to eventually clear the game, but really, the only regular star you absolutely need to get is the first one in Bob-omb Battlefield, where you have to... That was star 6, not the first one, wasn't it? Well, so much for that. Anyway, that kind of only reinforces my point. While there might be 120 stars in the game, to beat it, you only need 70 of them, just over half. Assuming, of course, you aren't flipping through a wall to go directly to Final Bowser or whatever the jank speedrun strat is. For the standard playthrough, though, you can just pick and choose which stars you get and which you skip. Since you need to meet certain thresholds to unlock specific doors, early on your choices are a bit more limited, but your options open up the further you get. With how linear most 2D Marios were, offering the occasional branching path or shortcut, if you were in the know, how much slack this game gives you is really refreshing. Plus, it offers some distinct advantages to the player as well. If you're stuck on a particular star, you can just go after something else, rather than bash your head against the wall trying to get that one that's giving you problems over and over again. And while there is a specific order each stage wants you to collect its stars in, most are available from the get-go, so even if you get stumped right away, you can just sequence break like how I showed you earlier, and get a later star before you're really supposed to. And hey, even if you're not having trouble, if you're maybe just getting bored with a specific stage, you can just move on and decide later whether you want to come back to it or not. It gives you so much freedom, and while I always enjoyed just messing with the game, seeing how out of order I could do things or collecting as many stars as I could early on to see how many doors I could unlock at once after a Bowser fight, I don't think I fully appreciated the game's way of doing things until I attempted a 100% run. Starting out, I was having fun just racking up the stars. As I went along, there were a few aggravating missions, like the 100 coin stars in levels that didn't have much more than 100, making it a tight window. When I got to endgame, I was ready to pull my hair out when it got to tick-tock clock. I think specifically the 100 coin thing again, if memory serves. When I collected 101 stars, I realized that my goal was turning a game I really liked into something I despised. So I decided that I needed to just eject and go for rescuing my love, the princess. Still though, it did help me realize just how brilliant and player-friendly 64's format was, so while I was a little disappointed in myself, I still did get something out of it. Perhaps one day though. Sunshine, on the other hand, takes a huge step back with this, which is probably the main reason why it's so divisive. I myself am not so much of a fan. While it has fewer levels, each of the standard stages has 8 missions instead of 6, with a total of 120 shine sprites, so it's on par for 64 with how many you have to collect. However, this time, the missions are set when you enter a stage, so there's no doing things out of order in a standard playthrough. Not only that, but to get to the final boss fight, you need to complete the 7th mission in each stage, which sees you chasing down Baby, Shadow, Bowser, Mario Jr. That means that unlike 64, a good chunk of the shine sprites are required, and doing the 8th mission in any stage or the mini levels, like the infamous Pachinko one, are largely pointless. Imagine struggling through that, only to find out that it's not really going to help you get those credits at all. Yeesh. And sure, getting the extra sprites will unlock some areas and tools early, but you have to realize that even if you're doing so to skip the blooper racing, you're only skipping it for now. You will have to do it later. While you still have some freedom in this one, it's only the freedom to choose what order you tackle some of this stuff. And if you're doing anything extra, it better be because you're in the mood for it. Still gotta do what you gotta do. Now, this probably shouldn't be that big a deal. I mean, plenty of past Mario titles are linear, and you can't do something like get tired of World 4, decide to play through more of World 3 instead, then go back to World 1 just to visit. So we are getting more here, but there's 2 things that make this really hurt. The first is that we just had all of that freedom in Mario 64, so we know what we're missing, and it's disappointing. The second is just how hard this game is. Go ahead, say it's a skill issue, call me a fake gamer or whatever, but even if this game doesn't give you much trouble, I hope we can at least agree that, compared to every other 3D Mario, this one's a step and a half up in difficulty. With how nice it was to be able to skip the stuff giving you trouble in the previous title, not being able to do so here when you really need it, really sucks. Galaxy kinda takes a middle of the road approach. Each stage has several missions, there being set paths through each so that there's no real sequence breaking. If you manage to find an alternate route, it'll likely take you to a secret star rather than a later one. The levels come in clusters, and to unlock new sets, you need to beat the previous boss to claim their Grand Star. Individual stars, though, just expand how far off you can reach in the cluster, so more stars equal more levels. Like in 64, that means your options are kind of limited early on, but really expand the further you get in. You can skip around quite a bit late game, and if you're thorough early on, to an obsessive degree, you can sometimes enter a new cluster and go immediately to the boss. And while the bosses are still mandatory, when it comes to pretty much everything else, you can pick and choose to play or pass. I'm sure there are whole speedrun flowcharts based around which ones can be hammered through the fastest. While the individual stages aren't quite as open as 64's, there's still a ton of freedom to play the game how you want to, whether it's picking and choosing, knocking out the easy missions so you can skip the harder ones later on, or just soaking up all the stars you can. So it's still a pretty user-friendly experience. 3D World has you tackling levels like normal, the main goal being to get from one side of the stage to the flagpole at the end. Both it and 3D Land feel like a reinterpretation of the classic 2D ones, having a linear set of levels with either splitting paths or shortcuts to spice things up a bit. So honestly, you could say they're a bit restricting compared to the previous 3D titles. What makes them unique, though, is the collectibles that you find in each stage. 3D World has 3 green stars in each, and while you can clear the levels without finding any, you need to build up a high enough total of them to open up things like the boss castles. You track down the stars by completing challenges or keeping your eyes out. While there's limited wiggle room in what stages you complete, there's a ton when it comes to what you have to snag. Did you run through the level multiple times and can't find the middle star for the life of you? Don't sweat it, just look a bit harder in the next one. Don't have the sweet moves to grab a star in the stage you're currently in? No big deal, you can revisit an early world and get some you previously missed instead. You're still expected to play the bulk of the game, but rather than demanding perfection or letting you just skip through while engaging with the stages as little as possible, it sets a pretty reasonable baseline for what it wants you to accomplish. Odyssey's where it gets really wild, though. You enter a new area and need to find a set number of power moons to get to the next. While there's normally a specific sequence you're meant to do first, there are still plenty of moons you can collect along the way, if you look around corners and alleyways and just, in general, keep a sharp eye out. Once you complete the main objectives, you typically see some changes in the area, either major, like New Donk City going from a dark and stormy night to a bright sunny day, to minor, like maybe the NPCs are relaxing and offering more side activities now that there aren't so many bad guys lurking around. This is when things really open up and you're free to just mosey around, finding any moons you might still need or just explore and have a good time. How complex it is to get each moon also varies. Some, you simply need to strike something that's glowing. Others, you need to complete an old school pixel side-scrolling section. Still more, you need to invest some time and effort into, though typically these offer a moon for each step of the sequence you complete. Beating bosses normally snag you 3 moons at once, so they generally try to make the reward match the effort required. With the variety of tasks available, it's no surprise that this is the game with the most collectibles, you being able to accumulate a total of 999 power moons. Bowser's Fury seems to borrow a little bit from everywhere. The collectibles are called Cat Shines, and Bowser Jr.'s tagging along with his paint tricks, so sunshine stuff, and everything is cats, taking 3D World's theme to the max. It seems to borrow most heavily from Odyssey and 64 when it comes to progression though. The world is a set of islands, more of which open up as you defeat the boss round for your current set. Each island has 5 missions, which you can clear out of order, though a few need to be triggered by getting previous shines, much like in 64. Some missions come standard for each, such as the first being to reach the island's lighthouse, there being one to collect a set of cat chips, and the last typically being to break the Bowser blocks, while others are unique, like collecting blue coins or beating a mini-boss. The standard ones help you know what to look out for, and if you can't figure out what the special ones are, you can leave and come back later, at which point reaching the island should give you a brief description of the next mission on the list, as a hint. Gather enough cat shines to access the boss fight, and win to open up more areas. Pretty standard at this point. As for getting from island to island, Plessy hangs around, and you can hop on their back to freely move between each, though if you haven't cleared out enough of Bowser's goop, you may have to take some detours. And of course, there's some side missions scattered in between islands, where you can get some bonus cat shines, much like the extra challenge stages in between the main ones in previous games. I forgot to mention those in the previous chapters, didn't I? Stuff like the hidden rooms in 64 and the single gimmick 1-star challenges in Galaxy. Man, I'm really bad at this, though I did mention Pachinko at least. Either way, it's hard to decide what's more open, this or Odyssey, since that game gave you an overwhelming amount of things to do at once, while this one, while smaller in scale, contains one big, seamless area. No need to load into a new level. With these two being back to back, it really makes you wonder what they're planning for our plumber, doesn't it? While it might not be quite as big, it still gives you a ton of options, and that it kept the mission listing makes sure that you're never totally in the dark with what you still need to do. That's 6 styles of progression, so which one do I think is the best? Funnily enough, I'd probably give it to 64, and my favorite's Galaxy, so you can't accuse me of nostalgia here. It has a good mix of structure, since there are missions listed out so that you can do them in order, options, since you can just ignore those with some light sequence breaking, variety, with the red and 100 coins being the only big example of missions getting reused, and more freedom, since there's probably the fewest number of required bosses and levels in this one. With all those criteria laid out, you might think Odyssey is the more appropriate choice, but I have just one major gripe with it. With how much there is to do here, several of the moons just feel like nothing, you sometimes earning one by just literally kicking a rock. While I get the appeal of exploring a vast area, playing around with everything you find, and getting rewarded for making your way into some curious places, for me, when some of those rewards come for simply breathing, it just doesn't motivate me to engage with the game all too much. My favorite parts of Odyssey were the linear bits, like the opening sequence in New Donk City and Bowser's Castle, since it felt like I was working towards and accomplishing something. Maybe I should do a video at some point on why open world and crafting doesn't seem to click with my ADHD. While a fine game, I just wasn't as over the moon as most people were when it came to Odyssey. As for what formats I like best, not what I think is the best, I prefer 3D World and Bowser's Fury. Both had structured formats, either standard stages or mission list, and while the latter is open, that structure helps keep me on task, rather than wandering off. Both reward exploration, creative thinking, and skill in the form of their collectibles, and while no specific star or shine is required, the total needed to advance is reasonable enough that it keeps you engaged without getting frustrated and wanting to quit. Not too many points where I needed to grind some out either, things felt just right. The newest 2D game, Wonder, even seems to resemble 3D World the most closely. The worlds are laid out similarly, but you have more wiggle room when it comes to what stages you knock out, and to progress, you need to collect enough Wonder Seeds to unlock boss castles and a few of the paths forward. The main point of each stage is getting to the flagpole, same as 3D World, but you actually get one Wonder Seed for doing so and the other extra one for exploring and engaging with the game's mechanics. It's a bit of a middle ground between that game and the early NES titles, since you can advance both by being curious and by just completing levels, though the second option will take longer. As for Galaxy, I just really like the stages and gravity effects, which is why it's my favorite. The only one I don't like is Sunshine, due to its rigid nature and higher difficulty, which forms a pretty mean combo. All that said, talking about each title and going back to get footage kinda makes me want to attempt 100%ing each, besides Galaxy, which I've already managed. And yes, that includes Sunshine, though I did get oddly close when I first played it as a kid. But what about you? Which 3D title do you think did it best? Which was your favorite, and are there any you dislike? Any advantages or disadvantages I failed to mention? Should I take a closer look at any of the games? That'll do it for this week, so thanks as always for watching. Maybe consider subscribing if you're into platformers, especially Mega Man, since that's what I typically cover here. Did I really do a Mario video right after a game came out, only to barely address the new topical title? Oh, mamma mia.